Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'asuk b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
V'arev na Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toracha b'finu u'pi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzenu v'tzetz amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah le'amu Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chayvanu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai notenu Torah.
Amen.
Okay. So everybody, thank you for yesterday, for trying to pursue through it. And we went with an individual session for each person because everybody thinks and learns differently. So just in summary, I think the way forward is everybody's got limited time. You're not going to be able to do revision and preparation and all of this because you've got a lot going on in your lives. And I'll do too. So I think the best thing is if you prepare, then whatever I'm telling you, you're going to be able to pace with my audio because you're going to know what's going on. You're not hearing it for the first time. I went through that in the audio. I don't know. I'm sure you all agree it's going to be the most successful run. The reason why it's going to start to get harder is because now what we're doing is we're building daf upon daf. The first 4 daf were all independent of each other to a certain extent. There was a bit of sequential reasoning, but they were pretty independent of each other. Now what we're going to do is start to formulate legal arguments, and now it's going to start to get a little bit harder. And then it's going to get harder still. So the good thing of it is that if we do Bava Kamma, everything else will seem like a breeze. I don't know if anybody did brochas before. Gemara brochas.
No.
That's excellent.
Yeah, it was a bit simpler, wasn't it, guys?
Yeah, excellent.
A little bit simpler. Okay, Kev, are you with us? Thanks, bud. All right, so let's get started. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the daf, and when I do it in terms of summary, you should be able to cope and see where we are. Just give me 1 second. I don't have to share my screen with the chart. I think you guys know the chart in your sleep. Okay. So we started on 5A4, and we started with the Mishnah, the ox is not like the Maveh, and then the Maveh is not like the ox. So the Tana of the Mishnah is saying, so who's the Tana? We said it was Rav Zavid saying in the name of Rava. Why was it necessary for the Torah to mention both of these damages? Let the merciful one write only one of them and let the other be derived from one. So the Tana then responds, one damager cannot be derived from the other one. So obviously we learned in a nutshell that the reason is that their unique features make them too dissimilar to the other. And you could think it's the unique feature upon which we make the person chayav and obligated to pay. So one damager is the equivalent of playing a chess game with a knight and a king against another king. You're just not going to get checkmate because of the differences. You're going to at least need a knight and a bishop. So the next section of the Mishnah states, and neither this nor that, the ox and the maveh, which are living things, etc. So what's the Tana saying there? Now, this particular Tana is Rav still, but it's his student Rav Mashashia that's saying in him that basically sometimes 2 damages are not enough. Why are 2 damages not enough in this particular case? Because if you have a look, it says, let the merciful one write 2 damages, ox and maveh, and let another damager 5 be derived from them. 1 damager from 2 can also not be derived. Why? Because as we said, that it basically says that 2 damages that are living have a common feature at which they don't resemble fire, which fire doesn't have its own mindset, desires, or drives. So even sometimes when you take 2 and say, okay, let's in essence take 2 damages and show that the unique features is not what we convict a person for. And whose phone keeps going? Arth, please just put it on silent.
No, Arth is on mute.
Silent, James.
Okay, I can't see. I'm just hearing it. It sounds like I'm in an arcade game. All the phones are going. So all I'm saying is that you cannot mention 2 damages in all cases. In many cases you can, because if the common features are enough where they cancel out the unique features, you can mention them, as long as the common feature itself doesn't exclude it from the third feature you're trying to compare it to. So you'll have two cases where two damages are not enough. So for example, if you're trying to convict on a non-living thing, like a fire or a pit or any damager that's not living, you can't take two living damages and compare, because the defense for that could simply be that you're convicting on a living damage of your two examples, because that's a common feature, and not a damager that does not exist in terms of its own mindset, etc. So then two damages are not enough. And even in certain cases, three damages are not enough. Let's just take an example. If we take an example of pit, we can say with pit, if you take ox, mave, and fire, and you put them together, they can't argue against pit, because my defenses on pit is that, yes, they all or have got unique features, ox, mave, and fire, and that they're different to each other. So they don't resemble a pit. And those unique features, I could say that's the reason why you're obligated to pay for the damage. And then if you want to bring the argument of, well, they all share something in common, I'd say, yes, one of the things they share in common is that they come forth in damage. My pit is minding its own business, and you didn't look where you were going, and you and your animal fell into my pit. So in that particular case, you couldn't take even those three damages and put them against the one to try and convict. Why? Because they're dissimilar in terms of their common characteristic, in that they go forth and damage. That's the criteria, which is unlike the pit, which is stationary. Now, so far, does all of this make sense?
It's clear. It's much clearer than what it was, especially after our meeting yesterday, but thank you for that.
Pleasure. Okay, so then what we want to say is look, there's certain things why, well, then we say, well, okay, bottom line, we're having a problem. So we're saying, okay, understand, but where are we getting to with this point with this whole Gemara, with this particular daf side? So we're saying, all right, there's a couple of points to derive here. The first point to derive is that why does it bring these individual cases? Remember, in total, they're 26. How do we get 26? We get Rav Chia's 24 plus two other damages. One of them, for example, is an informer that informs against the non-Jewish authorities to have his fellow Israelites' property confiscated, etc. But and so there's 24 plus 2, that's 26. So there's 24 of Rav Chia. Rav Oshia takes 13 of that. Let's just say what those 13 are in a simple way. Is that again, it's the 4 from the Mishnah. Rav Chia also does plus. Rav Oshia says 9. What are the 9? It's damages to man. So you've got nezek, actual damage, and then you've got pain, medical, convalescing, and humiliation in certain cases. Then you've got the four sort of custodians. You've got the renter, the borrower, the unpaid custodian, and the paid custodian. Okay, those are the 9 in total. And obviously, there's 4 in the Mishnah. So there are going to be cases where they are going to occur in history more than the 26. So that's the one thing, is that we need tools to be able to make somebody pay if they're trying to wangle out a payment. And one of the ways that law works is 2 things you need. Is number 1, evidence that the crime was committed. But evidence on its own, it's not enough. Why? Because unless it's prohibited by law in that particular country, you can get away, you can do it. There's no prohibition. Then it doesn't matter if they're witnesses. You transgress nothing. So it has to be written into law. So often what happens is human nature hasn't changed in thousands of years. A 21st century case can be analogous to an 18th century case, because human beings have been trying to wangle out of payment and do each other in since the dawn of history. So as long as you can have a logical sequence where the cases are similar, and sometimes one case is not an exact fit, where you need more than one case to prove your particular case of culpability, that's why you need to understand law process. Another thing that the first 4 dafs came to bring were the unique features. Unique features mean that not every damager is comparable to another damager, meaning that there's certain extenuating circumstances that make one obligated. So, for example, if I accidentally damage you and I have to pay, for sure in a case where I maliciously try to damage you, the payment is worse. or at least you're as culpable. Let's just take homicide. We've used this example before. Some almost manslaughter, where you kill somebody in a fit of rage and you don't mean to, and you get in a bar fight and they accidentally cut their jugular with a beer glass and you're terribly sorry. You'll go to jail for life, but you probably won't get the electric chair. If you plot and scheme, no cranberry. Go and have something to eat. You've been fed. Sorry, guys. So in a case where somebody is plotting to murder another, say he's met his lover and he decides that the husband is getting in the way and decides to off the husband, and he premeditated it with the wife and claimed the insurance money, for sure they're both going to get the chair. So what we see there is premeditation is obviously worse. So sometimes you'll have a unique feature which obligates you to either full payment or death penalties or criminal charges or civil charges. So the unique features count. Then you've got exemptions. Sometimes the Torah mentions specific cases to exempt in certain situations. Now there's two sort of exemptions. There's what you call financial leniency, like in the case of Tam and Muad, where the person does not have to pay the full amount, and that's what you know as a leniency. And then you have what you call a total exemption, like, for example, if a shane or regel damage in the public domain, where you don't have to pay it all. But what it's come to show is the full force of the law is not against you in that particular case. So why these damages were mentioned specifically in the Torah is very clear, is that it's coming to bring certain unique circumstances. And that has to be taken into account. I mean, Gavin mentioned a good point yesterday. When I was talking about Pit and Keren trying to convict for Shane, he said, yes, but in Pit and Keren, where you're not exempt in the public domain and Shane you are, it seems unfair. And he's absolutely right. And the reason why he's right is only because the Torah says you're not liable to pay for Shane in the public domain. And the Torah mentions it because sometimes if you bring two damages, it comes to make the payment more extreme in the third, which is why Hashem brings exceptions or leniencies in certain cases. Do we have any questions up until now, guys?
No questions for me.
No questions yet.
Okay.
That's fine.
So I think the yesterday's session was very, very helpful. What we are going to discuss quickly is that most of the damages we could have almost worked out the leniency, except that the Torah does mention, for example, that with Keren, it does, for example, bring Tam and Muad, etc. But why I did that chart yesterday was very, very simple, is that it gives you a summary of what is a unique feature, what is a leniency, etc., etc. Now, what I want to just do for 1 second is I want to share the chart, and then I'm going to just go further. Just give me 1 second, guys. And I'm trying to. I might not win the what do you call it? Software Techie of the Year. Okay. All right. Now, guys, you can see what's on my screen, right? Here. Tell me when you can see it. All right. So why I did that chart in Coral Draw is it's always fascinated me. I think people in previous generations were obviously a lot smarter than me. Sometimes, unless I see a chart, I don't understand it fully. And I think there should be a site that actually has these sort of charts. I mean, the chart isn't sophisticated, but it tells you everything. It tells you the unique feature, the leniency, etc., etc. Now, if you look at this chart, it explains why, even if you take all the living features of all the living avot, why you can't convict on a fire or pit. Why? Because it doesn't have a desire, drive, or mind of its own. So you could say that the common feature of Keren, Shane, Regel, and Maveh isn't enough to convict for fire or pit. Why? Because it's not analogous. The fire and the pit are clearly different in that they don't live. So why is pit the glue factor? Well, the pit is the glue factor is because it's got certain unique features to it. The one thing, it's stationary. So if you come to me and attack me with fire and Maveh and say, listen, you owe for pit, I can say, listen, you stumbled into my pit. You didn't look where you were going. Maveh and fire come forward to damage, the same as Regel, Shane, and Keren. So on that basis, you can't convict me on pit because it's stationary. You've also got a case where, so pit is kind of your glue factor where it's very difficult unless you've got pit in the equation and one other damager to convict for another damager. I'm not saying it's not possible. Let me give you an example. If you're coming to me with Keren, if say, for example, Keren was not mentioned in the Torah, let's just say, and you wanted to convict me with Shane and Regal, the argument would be very difficult because of the leniency aspect. What's the leniency aspect? Is the fact that you want to say to me that Shane and Regal you have to pay for. So you'll win on the first argument. So you'll win on the first argument because I will say to you on Shane, in return to Shane, I'll say, listen, my animal did not get physical gratification, and that's the reason why Shane is prohibited in the Torah. Your argument of Shane is not going to convict me on Keren because they're too dissimilar. And then when you bring Regal into it and you say, listen, Regal comes to prove that physical gratification is not a reason for obviously making somebody culpable for payment. It's not the unique feature. It's the fact that both Shane and Regal were my property and they damaged your property. And since they damaged your property, it obligates me to pay. And if I turn around and say, well, listen, my animal didn't create damage through normal movement, you can say that Shane, which is a prohibition against an animal which derives physical gratification, proves that you don't need common damage through normal movement in order to obligate a person. So the unique feature is cancelled out by bringing two different damages, because what we're doing here is we're cancelling out each unique feature by saying what do they have in common. And what do they have in common in this case is that they're your property and they go forward to damage, and the obligation of watching them is on you. But here's the problem with the case of Shane and Regal against Keren, is I could turn around and say, listen, I see there's a leniency here. We're exempt in the public domain for Shane and Regal. My ox, Keren, damaged your ox in the public domain. And therefore, based on the two common factors of the exemption, who's to say I'm responsible for paying in the public domain? Do you see the problem? Everybody see the problem?
Yes.
Okay, good. So in that case, it's very difficult to make Keren's stick with Shane and Regal because even their common feature provides for an exemption. It's much easier to convict on Regal if we take Keren and Shane. Let me tell you why. You want to convict me for Regal, which is the common damage to normal movement. My for example, ox goes through and knocks over your vase in the shuk in the market, and you come to me in court and you can say, listen, you owe me for the vessel, and I'll turn around to you and say, why? And you say to me, according to Keren and Shane, you owe money for the ox that did damage. My argument back would be twofold. I would say, firstly, how can you just say because it's an ox, it's a blanket rule for damage for an ox? It's like saying a Jew once shafted me out of money, so therefore all Jews are crooked in business. You can't make a general principle based on for example, the breed of animal. Just like maybe it was my yak that came to snag a vessel with hair. So you can't convict based on the fact that it's an ox. It's not, for example, the type of creature that caused the damage. Ox is a term that's mentioned in the Torah to describe the most common sort of animal that does damage. Why is ox the most common? Because its sheer size is heavy and clumsy. You've heard that expression, a bull in a china shop. They're clumsy and wild. And obviously an ox is going to do more financial damage than a goat. A goat is not very heavy. So I could say you can't convict based on the species, and you can say yes, but I'm convicting on Keren and Shane based on the fact that it's written that if it's your property and you fail to look after it, that basically you are obligated to pay. Now, the reason why you have to bring Keren and Shane in unison is very simple. Is if you bring in Keren alone against Regal, I'd say, yes, you have to pay for Keren because your animal intended to damage. Whereas my ox that damaged normal movement had no intention to damage. then you can have nothing to argue. But if you bring Keren in unison with Shane, and you say, listen, Shane is proving that intent to damage is not a reason why you have to make a payment, because in Shane you pay where there's physical gratification on an animal. So therefore we see it's not the unique feature of the animal that obligates a person to pay, but rather the common feature. And what's the common feature? Is that it's your property, and if it damages, you're obligated to make sure to make financial restitution. And the difficulty is I can't claim and say, listen, I don't have to pay, because in the case of Keren, you have to pay in the public domain. In the case of Keren, you don't. So there's a case where sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. The reason why Shem mentioned regul in the Torah is because, as Gavin said, sometimes you might come to force somebody to make a payment when in fact there should be a Torah leniency. I'm sure that makes sense. One of the reasons why we bring Maveh as an example with Keren, the classic case of Rashi and Tosfot, is they bring a case of Keren and Maveh. Why? Because when somebody says, yes, but you have to pay because your animal intended to damage, the proof of Maveh according to Rav is that one of the totals of Maveh according to Rav, one of the opinions brought forward, is that a man damages in his sleep is fully muad to pay. He's forewarned and he has to make full payment, because whether or not he intends to damage in his sleep, he's got to be aware that he could thrash around in his sleep because he doesn't have control, and therefore might damage whether he intends to do it or not. And that's proving that intent to damage of Keren is not the reason why you're obligated for payment. Rather, the fact that man or his property created damage, and when you damage, you have to make financial restitution. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah, good luck.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think yesterday's session made a huge difference. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to learn that there are 40 cases, not 40, sorry, guys, don't get a fright, four. There's only four. There's 4 damages cases where it's not exactly analogous to each other. What I mean, you sometimes have a case where it's not quite pit and it's not quite fire. We're going to go through 4 cases where, I don't know if you've ever seen that kids, they play in a box where, have you ever seen when a kid first learns how to play, there's a box and there's a square and there's a circle and a star. And they try and put a physical positive shape into a negative hole, of a star into a round. There's a round container. I don't know if you've ever seen it. And there's something cut out of it like a star. And the child has to put a physical star into the positive space, into a negative space. So when you're first learning how to process, you take the most literal example and put the one into the other. Then as you get older and you start to do home improvement work, you can see that the wall's not straight. This is not exactly like that. That's not exactly like this. And sometimes you need an amalgamation of 2 cases, because sometimes your court case is not exactly like the one case, because that is a perfect reality. Whereas in life, things obviously have extenuating circumstances. And that's why we bring in this to the fore. So this was covered in 5A4, 5B1. Before we go on, I want to show you why pit is necessary. Just give me 1 sec, guys. All right. Right. Now, this chart is brilliant. It says if the Torah had written such and such, we could not derive liability for such and such because. Now, this chart explains what I'm saying. So if you take any combination of Shane, Regel, Man, and Fire, we could not derive Keren and Pit. Okay? Keren is obvious. There's a biblical precept that what? For the first 3 times that an ox gores, it's tum. It's tum. It's not muad from the outset. Remember, all the other damages are muad from the outset. What does muad mean? 2 things. Muad means you were warned, and therefore you have to make full payment. If you took Shane, Regel, Man, and Fire, and by the way, even if you take Pit, I don't know why it doesn't mention Pit there. There is a problem. Can you see there's a problem with this chart in Schottenstein? Guys?
Why does it say pit stationary?
No, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Let me unpack this chart. What I'm saying is, for Shane, Regel, Man, Fire, and Pit, You all muad from the beginning. You all muad. You make full payment, except for Keren, where you either make time payment for the first 3 times and muad on the 4th time. Okay? I don't know why it's got pit here, because pit should be here when bringing forward the principle of Keren. This chart made a mistake, believe it or not, the Schottenstein chart. So Shane, Regel, man, fire, and pit, full payment from the first offense. Keren is time for the first 3 offenses, meaning half payment from the gufa of the animal. And on the 4th time, you muad full payment from choice property. So if you did all of that, we could not derive liability or the leniency for Keren based on that. Now, if we take Shane, Regel, man, and fire, you could not derive liability for pit. Why? Because Shane, Regel, man, and fire, okay, and even Keren, there's a problem with this chart, by the way, means that it's ways to go forth and damage. And pit is stationary. And your argument back could say, well, you never looked where you were going. You fell in the pit. All the other damages go forth and damage. So you can't convict on pit because the others are not analogous in terms of their common property. They go forth and damage. You get what I'm saying? So pit is an exception. So what we're saying here is the reason the Torah writes it is that you couldn't derive liability for pit if you mention damages that just move, because pit is stationary. I'd say you didn't watch where you're going. My damager never attacked you. It never came forward to damage you. Do you get the defense? Then,
Correct.
then when we're going to Keren together with Shane, Regel, or man, you cannot derive fire and pit. Why? Fire is not a pit. Fire is not alive. Pit is not alive. Because what has Keren, Shane, and Regel, or Maveh, man, according to Rav, got in common, even according to Shmuel the Shane, is that they're from the anatomy of the living. So if it's a spit of man, which is the Torah of Maveh according to Rav, okay, it's another, apart from the sleeping man, it means it's the anatomy of man. It's a spit from his force. And if you look at Shane, it's the tooth, the anatomy of an animal. So anything to do with Keren, Shane, or Regel, Maveh, you can't derive pit and fire. Why? Because fire is not living and pit is not living. And you can't also derive it because those other things come forward to damage, whereas pit is stationary. Let's just go through the last example, Keren and fire. Now, when we say Keren and fire, is that Keren, if Keren damages an item, whether or not it's a usual way that an animal should damage it or not, you have to pay for Keren damage. But Shane, if an animal eats a glass light bulb, for example, let me use not a stupid example. Just say it eats a lampshade, okay, an ox. It goes to a shuk and eats a lampshade. You don't have to pay for it. Why? Because it's not food. It's a very unusual way that an animal should eat. So therefore, it's not fitting for it. Does that make sense? In other words, what's the leniency on Shane? If you look at Ma'avot comparison, is that with Shane, exempt for objects that are not fit to eat. You get what I'm saying? So that doesn't occur if you have a look at Keren and fire, because if fire seems to consume items, whether or not it's appropriate or not, you have to pay for it. So do you see what the difference is? And what's the stage with Keren and fire? They go forth and damage and put you stationary. So in other words, because Shane's got the leniency that if an animal eats items that are not fitting for it, you don't have to pay. Keren that damages items, or fire that damages items that are not fitting for it, you still have to pay. And Keren and fire go forward, and they're damaged by movement, whereas pit does not damage by movement, so they're not analogous. Do you see this particular chart according to Rashi and Tosfot? Guys, does it make sense? Any questions?
It's making much more sense. I get a much better idea of this chart right now. I'd like to go through it, obviously, with the recording. But
sure.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, so listen, this is just a bit of a summary. What we're going to do is is just hits a couple of issues, and that's what my chart did. Obviously, in the Gemara it says Shane and Rega were written separately to exempt them in a public domain. Why? It says because if it damaged in the field of another. It was Keren. Why was Keren written separately? To distinguish between Tab and Muad. Pit. Why was it written separately? To exempt for liability on utensils. If a donkey fell in a pit and the donkey got injured or was killed, you pay for the donkey and not the utensils. According to Rav Yehuda, you pay for the utensils, but you don't pay if man falls in and dies in the pit, because man should have been a little bit more aware. Look, why was man written? To obligate for 4 additional things. Obviously, nezek damage occurs always, which is the actual damage. But if man attacks man, there's 4 additional damages. What are those 4 additional damages? We said pain, healing, which is refuah, which is medical bills, convalescing, which is shevet, and humiliation in certain cases. So it comes to teach that when man damages man, there's those 4 other payments. If we look at Rav Yehuda, why is fire mentioned? Because the exemption that if a Picasso painting is hidden in a haystack, you don't have to pay for it. Rav Yehuda says that you have to pay for hidden items, and it even comes to include somebody's field that had been plowed. You have to pay for that if it creates more damage or scorched stones. But most of the rabbis say that for hidden items, you don't have to pay that are destroyed within it, because anybody can come and claim that you have to pay for a Picasso. So we're going to state 4 different cases, and I think we've done exceptionally well for today. I think that you guys have put in a lot of effort, and I wanted to thank you very, very much for persevering. And definitely the prep work once a week. That's all you have to do, is prepare in advance, so that the pacing of what I'm saying and your mind doesn't have to play catch up, because it's all familiar to you. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do the Schottenstein. I'm not even saying that you have to do any of the work. It's just we have to make a reasonable amount of progress. Not that because it's a sprint, it is a marathon, but it's not a picnic in the park either. There has to be a little bit of movement. Guys, I wish you a wonderful day. I hope you make money, and I hope you keep well, happy, and safe. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, man.
And warm. All right. I hope those in Israel aren't too warm, and I hope those in South Africa aren't too cold.
Thanks, Dan.
I hope we end up in Jerusalem next year, all of us, while they